It was a white and soundless place. Sands hadn't been exaggerating when he said the door led nowhere at all. The two of them walked through a blank. No light, no temperature, no sound that Frisk could hear save the rush of blood in his own ears. Their feet trod on something like solid ground, but no footsteps echoed in their wake. No horizon line to break earth and sky. At several points, Frisk had to shut his eyes before his head started to swim. He felt untethered, like soon even gravity would fail and send him floating up into infinity, and he held onto Sands' bony hand all the tighter. Sands' unbroken pace and the rustling blue of his hoodie was the only landmark in the expanse. Neither of them spoke. Possibly they didn't want to know what their voices would sound like in this airless space. Frisk leaned over until his cheek brushed Sands' sleeve. He anchored himself with the sensation. They didn't know how long they walked. There was no time here. They didn't move in any particular direction. There was no direction either. But, little by little, other sounds brushed the very edges of their hearing. A distant clitter, a delicate buzz, something like a sigh. They had the feeling of being watched. Camouflaged shapes dipped and swam through the skyless sky, white against brighter white. Frisk moved so close to Sands that he nearly tripped the skeleton up, but Sands just put his arm around Frisk's shoulders and kept going. They found him. They didn't see Dr. Gaster in the distance. There was no distance. Instead, as they walked, a shape slowly faded in from the blankness, as if gradually shedding layers of gauze, never becoming closer, but clearer all the same. And when he had fully solidified and his twisted shape towered over them both, Sands finally came to a halt, and Frisk felt his bones shake beneath his grip.
"Oh, God."
Sands' voice trembled.
"What did you do to yourself, WD?"
Dr. Gaster slumped cross-legged on the floor, arms splayed out at his sides, head askew like an unstrung marionette. He wore some dark and shapeless garment draped over his body like a shroud. The uneven pattern on the blackness and the glimpses of white fabric grinning through suggested it was a lab coat, scorched black. His head was seamless, smooth, deformed in numerous places. One eye socket pinned wide open, staring at nothing. The other a thin, downturned crescent. His mouth another black crescent to mirror the eye. The skull split in two places, one seam running along his entire scalp in a long, unbroken line, as though someone had tried to pry his head apart. He didn't look like a skeleton. He looked like a wax figurine that had passed through a blast furnace. And then there were the hands. Sprouting from Dr. Gaster's back were countless arm bones that spread across the void. They branched, they split, they rejoined again, like he had become the taproot of a macabre tree. Ranges of radii, forests of phalanges, they wavered like pale seagrass, and in their upper reaches, countless hands twitched and flexed. Some with fingers more delicate than toothpicks, others so massive that they could have borne up both Sands and Frisk in their palms. Hands studded with staring eyes, hands with palms split by toothy mouths, hands riveted with cameras, protractors, nameless machinery. Several arms instead terminated in monsters that dangled lifeless and gray like sad puppets, their eyes staring and blank. Frisk thought that some of them resembled people he knew, and several more resembled Dr. Gaster himself. Their joints clacked like the beaks of strange birds as they swayed. They sometimes seemed to pass through each other, or disappear into the whiteness and return elsewhere like a magician's trick. They all bent low towards Sands and Frisk, with a great creaking of bone and joint. They cast no shadow, but the two of them still felt the weight of those hands. Frisk wasn't sure whether to hold on to Sands even tighter, or try to hide behind him. Sands felt his tugging arm and looked over to him.
"Don't worry, kid. He's not dangerous. I just thought I'd have been more prepared for this."
He held up his arm, forcing Frisk to stand on tiptoe.
"Hate to say it, but I need you to let me go now."
Frisk turned pale, but slowly released his grip. Sands gave him a half-hearted wink. Then he sauntered under the canopy of Dr. Gaster's hands.
"Hey."
Somehow his voice remained steady.
"Sorry I took so long."
From everywhere at once came a grating, deafening wall of noise. The split palms babbled, the gray puppets shook. It sounded like sticking your head inside of a malfunctioning engine, or a dial tone turned to ear-bleeding volume, or 10,000 washboards being scraped at once. Frisk cringed and clapped his hands over his ears.
Yeah, I'm doing okay. Looks like you're still the same as ever, too, despite everything.
Sans looked over to Frisk.
Don't cover your ears when other people are speaking, kid. It's rude.
Frisk lowered his hands, then winced again at the next burst of noise. He noticed that all the hands wavered in unison during that din, clacking and twisting in acrobatic contortions. Sans watched the movement intently.
Yeah, this is the one. He's not much to look at, but DT's off the scale.
Glancing at Frisk.
The doctor always had some communication issues. No surprise they've gotten a little worse, given the circumstances. Don't worry, we have a system worked out. I'll interpret for you.
Hands swarmed Frisk like flies. Several camera flashes went off in Frisk's face. One hand, with its fingers replaced by strange, sizzling rods, gave his chest a gentle pinch, then flitted away. Despite the riot of movement whenever Dr. Gaster spoke or acted, his actual body remained lifeless and still. His own original hands didn't so much as twitch. Another blast of buzz. Sans nodded, then breathed deep.
Okay, Frisk, the doctor wants a word with you.
Frisk looked on the verge of panic.
Don't worry, he won't make you say anything you don't want to. And you might not understand, like, half the stuff he says, but go easy on him. He hasn't gotten to talk to anyone in a while. Ready?
Frisk stared up at the forest of hands, at countless unblinking eyes, the gray puppets with their heads all tilted in expectation. He swallowed hard and nodded.
All right, here we go.
A wave of noise and shudder.
So, you have arrived. Okay, starting with the obvious, I can dig it.
The hands clutched and flexed.
Let's not lose any time to useless introductions. Wow, bro, dial back the charm a little, why don't ya? Okay, it's him talking now. Sans has already told you who I am, and I have watched you for some time. The irregularities that you have created are impossible to ignore. Please do not take this as an accusation. I find your patterns admirable. Hey, you see? You've already made a good first impression.
Fingers snapped like wild animals. The gray puppets babbled at nothing.
You created significant unrest in time and space to locate me. You put my brother through a great deal of unease. Aw, man, come on, it wasn't a problem, really. And yet, I have observed that throughout it all, and despite temptation, you continued to be yourself. I have always respected perseverance. Yeah, clearly. So I took what limited measures I could to arrange this meeting, regardless of its eventual outcome. Now, tell me what you seek.
The hands went still. Sans leaned over.
That's your cue, kid.
Frisk wasn't sure whether to address the hands or Dr. Gaster himself, but he knew the answer, and he said it with confidence. Asriel. The hands chittered.
Asriel.
They seemed to laugh amongst themselves.
The doomed prince. Yes, I have observed his trail as well. The deception, the tragedy, the madness, the sacrifice. The end of his life created ripples of disaster that would extend for generations to come, and after many years, Asriel will break free of that bleak existence only to fall back into darkness. I would call it heartbreaking had I the necessary anatomy. Yikes, WD, working the rough chuckles there. That is the fate you wish to avert. That is why you continue to corrupt time. That is why you hold the future hostage from those who wish to live it.
Frisk's ears had begun to ache from the waves of snarl and rattle crashing in on them. Numerous eyes tilted in a way that turned their stare judgmental, but he held his ground.
Here is a difficult lesson for you to learn, human. All too often, happy endings are built on the misfortunes of others. As cruel as it sounds, the freedom and happiness of monster kind hinges upon Asriel Dreamer's miserable end. He suffered great pain, but when given the choice, in an act of supreme selflessness, he allowed that misfortune to become the foundation of a brighter future for all.
Sans's voice was toneless. He would no longer meet Frisk's eye.
But you will not respect his sacrifice. You continue your efforts without hesitation.
Clenching Bone huddled ever closer to Frisk.
I wish to hear your reasons why.
Sans inhaled deep, blinked several times.
Jeez, that was a mouthful.
Sans. Frisk still didn't back down as the hands moved ever closer, though he was shaking like a leaf. What should I do?
Give him an answer, of course. Don't worry, he's just putting on his lecture hall voice.
Another buzz, almost irritated.
Oh, come on, W.D., lay off him a little. The most brilliant mind in monster history trying to grill a grade schooler. Even I couldn't come up with something that funny.
He gave Frisk a thumbs up.
Just be honest, kiddo. With him and with yourself. It'll get you through every time.
The hands receded, just enough to give Frisk room to breathe. He stood before Dr. Gaster like a penitent. He tried to find the words. He remembered Asriel in the flower patch, head bowed, waiting for the end. Further back, Asriel in front of the barrier, surging with the power of every soul at once, pouring all his stolen life into the thing and trapping the people he tormented. Further back, Asriel holding him so tight that his claws had dug through Frisk's shirt, his muzzle digging into Frisk's neck. Still trying to smile as he said he didn't want to let go. Frisk said, "Did you see him too? After he changed back?" The hands turned to face one another. They seemed surprised at the question.
The point between his rise and fall, such moments are rare in the sea of time, but yes, I have observed several.
He never smiles. Frisk held himself tighter. Not really. Gaster said nothing. I mean, he always tries, but you can tell it's not real. It's because he's scared. He doesn't want anyone else to worry. Several hands rotated in Sans' direction. His pupils darted around.
What?
I don't know him that well, Frisk continued. I never got the chance. But I've met him for the first time, over and over. And I think he just hates to see other people get hurt. Especially after everything that happened. So when he tells me he doesn't want to leave, I think it's the same as his smile. He's telling lies, Frisk sniffed. Because he doesn't think there's any way to help without hurting someone else. He rubbed his eyes and looked up. Even if he really doesn't want to leave, I want to give him the choice. I think I'd be okay if he told me no, as long as it didn't feel like he was lying about it. But first, I need to find a way to help him without hurting anyone, and as long as I can, I'm going to try. He swallowed. His throat hurt from overuse. But I hope he says yes. I really want him to be my friend. He fell silent. Sans and Gaster waited to see if any more words were forthcoming, but that appeared to be the end of it.
There is a warm and fuzzy feeling all through my ribcage, Sans said. Very, very nice kid.
Frisk said nothing, but visibly reddened.
Hey, W.D., is he seriously the one responsible for sending time down the tubes? I'm starting to detect a flaw in our hypothesis here. My model was impeccable, Sans translated. The anomaly persists. The darkness at the end of time cannot be avoided. Several of the puppets tilted their heads. But perhaps its meaning may be malleable. I had good reason to believe that the terminus meant only ruin, but with enough determination it may instead signify a new future, one beyond the reach of any calculation. Every hand bent lower for Frisk. There is a way. Both Frisk and Sans' faces lit up. After my demise, my essence drew on the power of the core, my creation, beautiful and beautifully useless. But even as I was scattered across time, flung into the darkest corners of the underground, that power persisted. In the absence of anything better to do, I continued my research. I have observed the Sea of Time and noted every moment, their placement, their purpose, the ripples they leave behind. The hands were now moving so fast they blurred, turning near invisible against the blank white background. Sans was sweating in his attempts to keep up. Of particular interest was Asriel Dreamer's death. Of course, its connections were so bold and ran so far. When his soul left his body and shattered in the unforgiving air, the future shuddered in sympathy. Even now, I can see it, suspended in this placeless place. Human, with your blessing, I will reach out, seize hold of this moment in time, and copy it. Sans blinked. He couldn't seem to understand what he had just said. The hands resumed their commotion. I will pour the power of the core into that moment. One occurrence will become two. The second inviolate, immaculate, pure. Its events separate from the greater flow of time. If you possess the bravery, the determination, then you may venture into that uncharted dark and extract Asriel's soul before its dissolution.
Hide it within yourself. Keep that soul warm beside your own. Carry it to the end of all things, and perhaps you will find a way to bring the doomed prince home. Frisk's face had begun to hurt. It took him a moment to realize why.
Would you look at that, huh?
Sans leaned over, his grin wider than ever.
Kid's smiling ear to ear. Frisk, why the heck do you always look so down? That's a waste of a fantastic face.
Frisk flushed again and rubbed his dimpled cheek.
Man, we're making it rain miracles today, aren't we, WD?
The hands hung by their wrists. The puppets hung their heads. For a moment, the bony thicket seemed guilty. Slowly, the movement and buzz resumed. Sans tilted his head, his grin dampened somewhat, and translated.
The stress of this act will be severe. The consequences unavoidable. In the aftermath, I will... Oh, no. No. No way!
Frisk's smile disappeared. He looked back and forth between Sans and Gaster. Sans' skull was beating with sweat. His pupils shuddered in their sockets.
He's saying that this stunt will burn up all the juice that's keeping him here. He'll be dead for good after that. Yeah, kid, that sucks, I know. Since now we'll have to find a different plan, because that is not going to happen.
Frisk flinched. He'd never heard Sans shout like that before.
Frisk, tell him, I know you don't want this any more than I...
He was cut off by a snarl of static. The hands leapt and spasmed.
No, you don't get to pull this one on me now. I mean, come on.
Sans held his palms out, the look in his eyes turned pleading.
We've got Frisk's determination, your brains, my devastating good looks. We can find a way to bail you out of this too. One more miracle. No big deal, right?
The hands kept still. Sans' voice started to tremble.
WD, I'm begging you here. I came all this way. Don't do this to me again.
The ensuing noise was so fierce that Frisk had to cover his ears again. Even then, it sounded like he was standing within kissing distance of a waterfall. The leaping tides of screech bored through his ears. The hands waved so close to Sans that they nearly knocked him over.
No, I never thought that this was about me, but...
The puppets crowded him, all blank faces and bared teeth.
That isn't...
Several hands formed fists and pounded the soundless ground as the buzz rent the air. Sans stood with his arms limp and his head hung low. His pupils winked out, leaving dark sockets.
Okay, I get it, alright?
He angled his head to Frisk.
Hey, he's got more to say.
Frisk uncovered his ears, tried to approach Sans.
I'm fine, kid. Just listen.
The buzz resumed, gentler now.
Your protest is understandable,
Sans said quietly.
I have every cause to believe you wish for an end with no sacrifice. But, human, understand my predicament. I still do not know what presence lurked within the distortion in time, but when I called it forth with my observations, the blow it struck was remarkably potent. It severed far more than my life from this world. The marks I had made in the past, the bonds I had formed in the present, all were undone, all progress erased. And as I continued my notes here, I came to realize something. The marks I had left were, in the end, very faint. My bonds, very fragile. My research had amounted to nothing. My determination to succeed had called down only ruin on those I cared for. And when I finally passed from this world... Sans fell silent as the hands continued to move. He shook his head slowly. Oh no. WD, you know that's not true.
But Gaster remained still, waiting for his interpretation. Sans had to fight to let out every word.
When I finally passed from this world, few remembered me. Fewer missed me.
He looked away from Frisk.
And in all my observations, I found only one person who ever mourned me.
Sans stuck his hands in his pockets.
I'm okay. I just need a minute.
He took deep breaths. Frisk watched his shoulders rise and fall. Then Sans looked back up, and Gaster continued to speak.
I have spent too long here, filled with regret in this wretched state, unsure of how I continue to exist or why. The world perseveres without me, and I do not blame it. The future will always find a way to survive, though it may grow dim from time to time. However, if you desire a brighter future, If your happy ending demands misfortune, then I would be honored to sacrifice my own.
Dr. Gaster fell silent once again. There was a distinct air of exhaustion in the way every hand ceased movement at once. Frisk crept closer to Sans and grabbed hold of his arm.
Thanks.
His pupils flickered weakly.
Give him your answer, kid. Whatever you want. But do it now, okay? I think this translation shtick's run its course.
Frisk nodded, turned away, stepped forward. This time he addressed Dr. Gaster directly, that slumped, motionless figure from which every hand grew. He said, "Please." As one, the gray puppets nodded. Gaster's two largest hands, their pinky fingers taller than Frisk and Sans combined, shuddered into life. They reached up and up, their arm bones extending like telescopes until they disappeared into the blankness. There was a great grinding of stone, and the hands descended with a great archway clutched in their grip. Frisk recognized that whiskey-colored stone. It was the door to King Asgore's throne room. The hands bore it aloft high over Dr. Gaster like an offering. Other hands swarmed the doorway. More camera lenses flashed. Currents of electricity ran across its surface. Protractors took countless measurements in the blink of an eye, scraping inscrutable diagrams into the door's surface. And then they latched on. Hands skittered across the stone like spiders and grabbed every available surface, encasing the ark in bone. The gray puppets ringed Gaster with their heads raised like witnesses. Bone creaked as every arm tensed and began to pull. Dr. Gaster's eye burned. It began as a dim point in his wide-open eye, not unlike Sans' own pupils. But as the hands continued their exertion, the light grew and leapt and flared into a deep purple flame that spread even to the cracks in Gaster's skull, so that his head seemed veined with amethyst. Gaster's body finally twitched into life, his head lifting up, his mouth yawning open, as the flame leapt like a pilot light. Cracks spiderwebbed through his arms, cracks appeared in his skull like glazed pottery, and as the door itself finally began to crack, that now familiar static climbed into a cacophony that, at its very core, held a voice. Dr. Gaster's own, roaring into the empty air. Frisk had covered his ears again. Sans stared up at the door, motionless, as Gaster himself had been. The door split down the middle. There was a blinding flash. When it faded, all had fallen silent. Gaster was once again slumped over, and now he was flanked by two doorways, both identical down to the last mark in the stone. Frisk watched as the hands moved once more, but now their movement was jerky, uncertain, like a failing wind-up toy. A multitude of index fingers pointed to the left-hand arch. They heard a voice, without tone or character, jumping unevenly between words and even syllables, as though the sounds making up each word had been dragged from a great many places and hastily reassembled. "Your exit." The great stone doors swung open with oily silence. "Stay determined." The index fingers broke off from the hands, drifted up, grew transparent, were gone. They were followed by the other bones in each hand, and then the numerous forearms. Joint by joint, Dr. Gaster was coming apart. The drifting bones clinked against each other with a sound like wind chimes as they faded from existence.
"Frisk,"
Sans said,
"the same rule applies. You're about to go somewhere no one was ever meant to be. I don't know what you're going to find in there, or what might find you."
Frisk looked up at him, his expression worried.
"I know you'll be all right."
Sans rubbed Frisk's shoulder.
"But I got something to finish up here. You understand?"
Frisk grabbed Sans' wrist and nodded. He said, "Thank you."
"Yeah, well, same." He looked at Gaster, "for giving me a chance to say goodbye."
Frisk let him go and nodded to Gaster as well. The doctor himself still didn't move, but one puppet, a wide-eyed monochrome copy of the lively child he'd met in Waterfall, nodded back just before it detached and drifted into infinity like an untethered balloon. Frisk walked toward the open archway. The blackness within was absolute. He couldn't see how far it extended or where it led. The waiting dark filled him with determination.